and your CD-ROM drives, all those stuff. You're going to need one of these things for each of the devices inside your computer.
All right, I got my power supply in. What do I do next?
It's time to put in the motherboard. Now, actually, we should say something. You got a decision. There's a crossroads you come to here.
We're at a crux.
A crux.
All
we
right.
have to make a decision. We hate making decisions. You might too. You got two options. You can either put the motherboard into the case and then put all the other stuff onto the motherboard, or if you're a little nervous about working inside of here, especially if you're working with an Athlon processor, they're a little sensitive. I've broken one or two putting them together.
Or three.
You might want to, no more than four. Now this is your motherboard. What you may want to do is actually put the processor and the heatsink and the fan on the motherboard, and then put the whole thing assembled inside the case.
There's another thing you're going to want to do before you get the motherboard in there, and that's kind of prepare the case by putting the motherboard risers onto the case. Let me just show you. This case, like most cases, has many different screw holes in a lot of different places that you could put it. Let me make sure you can see that. So that's because every motherboard has different positioning of the screws on here, so they give you a lot of compatibility, a variety for compatibility. Very, very important that you put the risers in exactly where there are going to be holes for them on the motherboard. What you really don't want to do is put in a riser somewhere where it's not going to actually go through a hole in the motherboard, but touch the back of the motherboard. It can actually short circuit the motherboard there, and you'll literally ruin your motherboard. So where are my risers? I need some risers. You got some there?
There should be a little plastic package. Normally, a lot of times, they actually tape it down on the inside of your case.
There it is.
First thing you do when you get your case home, you take it out of its big box, you look inside, there should be a little plastic bag full of parts.
The risers, in my case, are brass.
Right.
They have a threaded screw on one end, and then they have a little pentagonal hole at the top. That's what the screw is going to come into from the other side on the motherboard. You'll also see I have some paper washers in there. You're going to use the paper washers to insulate the motherboard against the risers. So the first thing to do is to kind of look at where the motherboard is going to go in the machine, and you're going to orient it so that the connectors are on the back plane of the machine. They've got to line up with these connector holes on the back plane of the machine. See, for the peripherals, can you see that right down there? So we're going to make sure that those line up with this, and that'll give me some idea of where to put the risers in, because I have holes in my motherboard where I want to screw in the motherboard to the risers. So match the holes on the motherboard to where you're going to put the risers on the case. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. You know what, though? There's different ways of doing it. My case came with these little, sometimes they're plastic. In this case, they're actually little metal bits. And these do the same thing as Leo's brass risers. They stand up the motherboard off the bottom of the case, and they give you something to actually screw the motherboard down in there. Again, I have the same kind of screws with little paper washers. And again, you know what? You laid it down there gently. You look at there, and you figure out where all these holes are, and you put one of these risers for each of those. The places you especially want to be most careful about is around here, the front of the cards, the PCI slots, where you're mounting that down in there, because that's where you're going to be pushing these cards down in place. So make sure you use all of those.
Well, I've put in now 1, 2, 3, I'm going to put 6 risers in total, and I'm just going to see if I've matched up every riser with a hole on the motherboard. This is often difficult, and this is the tricky part here, is matching up the faceplate with the connectors you've got on the back of your motherboard. Sometimes they give you multiple faceplates. In this case, I've only got one faceplate. You may have to punch holes out. You see we have, it's not punched out here. That's because we don't need that. That's for extra USB ports. So if they're not punched out, you just take a screwdriver. May I borrow a flathead here real quickly? And you'll just pry off that little extra bit of metal so that you can get the connectors through there. We've already pried off all of the ones I need. This is going to be where my connectors for my sound card are going to go. This is a serial port. This is a printer port. We've got the mouse and the keyboard, the USB ports, and the extra serial ports here. So I'm just going to try to match those up.
Now these two things right here, these donuts, are actually where we're going to put screws in to tighten it down.
Donuts.
Donut. We like, you know, we're going to have donuts after we finish these. Sometimes, though, the little holes don't match up with the risers. Remember, we put the risers in to keep the motherboard off the bottom of the case. I don't want you, the last thing I want you to do, right, is to reach in here and start grabbing. This stuff all looks like handles. We got these little cans, they're called capacitors.
Handles.
They're not. You can rip them off. You can break them. What I want you to do is to work from the edge of the motherboard and to use the edge of the motherboard to slide it in place. Now, this is only going to work if you don't actually tighten down every screw on the motherboard as you go. Start them, turn them in a couple times, get every screw that you want to put in there started first, and then and only then tighten them all down. Because if you tighten all 4 of these and you have to shift the motherboard over here, it's not going to work.
Before I screw in my motherboard, let me do this outside so everybody can see what I'm doing. You can do yours inside. I'm going to take my motherboard back out of the case. Oh yeah, I was almost done. But I'm going to let Patrick win this race because I really want you to see it when I drop in this AMD chip and put the heatsink on it and put in the RAM. This socket right here is very common for any socketed chip. It's called a ZIF, or Zero Insertion Force Socket. When I raise the lever, it's ready for inserting my processor. 2 of the corners are cut. That's important. Those 2 cut corners have to match the same cut corners on the processor itself. So this is the orientation that I'm going to put the processor in. You do not have to push the processor in. It's a zero insertion force. That means no force. You see that? It just popped right in. And then once it's in, and make sure it really is in solidly all the way around, close the lever, and that grips the processor so it can't fall out. All right, now that we got the processor in, it's time to put our cooler on. Today's processors run so fast, so hot, you cannot run them. You cannot use them, Patrick. You cannot use them, Patrick, without a fan on them. This is a fan. It's very common, typical fan. It's got heat sinks. These fins here draw the heat up. The fan then blows the heat away from the processor. It's going to keep it at a reasonable temperature. Notice this one has a little sticker on it that reveals some nice thermal material. This is going to make sure we have a good contact with the processor and that the heat is, because the processor is directly in contact with the sink, is drawn right into that heat sink. Now notice there's a lip on this fan. That lip has to go right on the lip on the socket. So I'm going to now angle it in. It's going right in on there. And by the way, they've got little rubber pads on the AMD. What are those pads for? They're to keep me from pushing this down right onto the glass.
You can even buy little copper spacers that actually work even more than the little rubber pads to help keep you from doing that.
See that? Now this is the critical juncture. We've got some pressure on the chip here. What we really want to do is get this second tab on without cracking the silicon of the chip. Look at that. It's on there. This isn't going anywhere. It's really down and tight. And I don't think I heard any chink sounds. So we now have a heatsink, and you want to look. You want to make sure it's making contact with the processor, because you got to draw the heat off that processor. If this thing doesn't cool the processor, it's going to burn up. Now the fan connects to the motherboard. So different fans work different ways. Sometimes the fan will connect to a power tail off the power supply itself. In this case, the fan connects to the motherboard on a connector that is really near the processor. Right there. The one that says CPU fan. That's pretty easy. Of course, your motherboard manual would tell you where, but we're real men. We don't look at the manual, right? And I'm just going to connect it there. That's going to make sure the fan turns. Now, please, folks, the first time you power up, look very carefully at that fan. Make sure it is turning. If it's not, immediately shut off the machine. Find out why it's not, whether the connection's bad or not.
You will fry an Athlon if it does not have a heat sink and it does not have a fan on it in seconds. 1,000 to 1,000 gone.
Who speaks from experience.
Yeah.
Now over here we have the DIMM slots, and this motherboard's nice. It has 3. There are different configurations. You can have as few as 1, as many as 4 or 5. 3's plenty, especially nowadays where you can get 512 megabytes on a single one of these memory sticks. This is the RAM, the memory we were talking about. This is where all the programs and the data are going to go while the computer's working on it. And the DIMM slots are numbered 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to fill the low number slot first. That's this slot closest to the processor. Again, check your motherboard manual to find out which slot you should fill first. It may not be closest to the CPU, although it usually is. These little white tabs, open them up. These are the clips that's going to hold it in place. I'll close the 2 that I'm not going to use so that you can see where I'm going. I'm going to put it right in this one. And you'll notice that every memory stick has little notches cut in it. That's so you can't put it in wrong. See that notch right there? That's going to go and match up with the notch on the slot. There's no way to put it in wrong. In fact, I have to orient it this way. Slide it down gently into the guides. Right here. And right here. See how much easier this is to do when it's not in the case? It's still kind of tricky. There we go. Whoops. There we go. And then you're going to gently, without trying not to torque the chip, I'm going to push this down, and these clips are going to come up holding in place, but you got to push a little bit of force. Try not to torque it. There we go. That one's in there, and that one's in there. And you'll know when it's in well. First of all, these white clips will be exactly as the other ones are that are already closed, and it'll feel firm and nice in there. That is good. Now, this is one stick. That's all we're going to put in this one, but you have room for expansion. It's good to know how to do this because down the road, you may want to expand your processor. Now, there's other stuff that's going to go on this motherboard, our video card, our sound card, and my modem. But I'm not going to put that in yet. Now I'm ready to put the motherboard into the case. How you doing over there, Patrick?
I'm doing pretty good, actually. Now, Leo had this pretty fancy little tube of thermal grease. I got something even crazier. Ours, the one for this chip, came it came in a little syringe without a needle.
You're going to be tempted to put too much thermal grease on. You only need a little dab. You want a thin film of grease on there. You don't want a whole layer of, you're not icing a cake here.
Basically, it facilitates the contact between the heat sink on the chip and this heat sink. Some people actually, they take Milian grade sandpaper and they make this absolutely perfectly flat. We're normal people. We're just going to use a little bit of thermal grease to make that connection good.
My motherboard's in. I don't know how you're doing, but I'm feeling pretty good. In fact, this is the time when you really do want that manual because now's the time when you connect these fiddly bits. I hate doing this part. This is the part where you're almost guaranteed to skin a knuckle or tear some hair out. These are the reset switch, the power switch, the LEDs, the little light that lights up. It even says what's on here, that lights up when the hard drive is accessed or when the power is on. These have to be attached to connectors in your motherboard. I got another one down here. And they have to be attached to the right connector in your motherboard. It is usually an array of pins, there is in mine anyway, in the corner of your motherboard closest to the front of the machine, the bottom front of the machine. They're right down here. It's kind of hard to see. And they may even have silk screened the functions of these pins onto the motherboard. So if you've got a magnifying glass or reading glasses, you might be able to actually read it. It's a whole lot easier to find that information in the manual. Here's another one I'm going to connect. This is the PC speaker, you know, the one that goes beep. Not the one that plays music, but just the one that goes beep, beep, beep. You really do want to connect that. I know you think you don't need it. Here's where it does come in handy. When the computer first starts up, we'll talk about this a little bit later, it makes beep sounds to tell you how it's doing. And if it can't start up, it'll beep a certain number of times, and you can use that to diagnose what's wrong with the computer. So make sure you do connect your speaker in here. Boy, I wish I had my reading glasses. I can see it is silk screened on the motherboard, but it's kind of hard to see. Another thing that's kind of tricky is knowing which way to put it in, and sometimes the only way to figure that out is trial and error. There's a plus and there's a minus, and you just got to get the right way. They'll all be oriented the same way. Do you have any trick to that, Patrick?
You know something? I just turned my case around just so I could align my case with the little diagram that's inside the manual.
That. Aren't you
exactly.
Smart? I'm just putting it in as kind of an experimental way, and what we'll do is we'll turn it on. It won't inhibit the machine from starting by any means. It just either the light will light up or not. If it doesn't, easy enough. Again, one of the reasons you're not going to put the case back together and close it all up until you're sure you got everything done.
All right, well, Leo's wrestling with his case over there. Let's talk about what we're doing here. These are called muffin fans or biscuit fans or any of another affectionate things, these little round things.
Biscuit fans.
Biscuit fans. I'm just a biscuit under 250.
I'm getting hungry.
Let's take a look at this case for a second. Like Leo said, we're going to pull air in through here. We're going to suck in air through the bottom of the front of the machine, and we're going to blow it back out up here at the top of the machine out of the back. Now, you want to make sure that your fans align the right way to do that. This one's pretty nifty. They have a little plastic cage here for the front. And watch this. Now we have the fan and the cage, and this is all going to create a little sandwich right on the front of our machine. So we'll take a look at this one. This is pretty slick. I got to admit, I'm admiring this.
So you can put the label side out because that's the direction of the air, or label side in because that's the direction of the air.
So in this case, I'm going to be drawing air in. So we're going to lay that down in here, label side in, and we're just going to snap that in place. It all line up. Now we have a little fan sandwich there. The fan sandwich is going to go right up here in this case. Now you might actually have to bolt this thing down on the inside of your system. You might be using more screws for this. Again, be gentle. Remember how you took it off to put it back on.
This is nice because the wire trims right up through a slot in the muffin fan case there. So this connector is going to end up connecting to a power tail that comes off the off the power supply in the case. That's how it's going to drive it. Sometimes the fans will also connect directly to the motherboard. It's nice when you get fans that do, because then as I said earlier, their rotational speed can be monitored, and you know the fan's working. The worst thing that can happen in a case is the fans die, the cooling dies, and the case overheats, and you don't even know what's happened.
Now, on the back side of this system, again, we told you we're going to put the label in. That's the direction of the air, Leo says.